and we'll begin from here. Now, I'm in charge of the presentation tonight, so I'm multitasking, which is always a trial, but hopefully it will all match together as we go through. So let's begin with a brief recap on where we were last week. So last week let's go back to the first week, sorry. We began with the Christianization of Russia from its very earliest mythical beginnings, with the narrative of conversion from Kievan Rus, which then moved us forward to a gradual move from west to east, really. And then with the fall of Byzantium, the establishment of a real idea of Russia as its own part of the Christian heritage. In the second week, we saw how that fall of Byzantium, the rejection of the Council of Florence by Prince Vasily II, led to Russian Orthodoxy breaking away from its Byzantine parent, but also from the West in a broader sense. But at the same time, that break, as we saw last week, was not in any way, shape or form absolute. And we saw that with the reforms and changes that came under Peter the Great, which were then, to a lesser degree, continued with Catherine, and the nation leaned back towards the West. And so there's always been that tension of East and West, what the historian Nicolas Berdyaev called the split foundations upon which Russia was built. So last week we explored how those split foundations rather came to a head with the Slavophiles and the Westernizers, those who sought to move towards progress, and progress being a sort of westernized rationalism, and those who sought progress to be via a rediscovery of Slavic traditions and the reunification of the Slavic nations. That dispute, that disagreement, that creative dialectic between the westernizers and the Slavophiles was then taken forward by the almost romantic movement that was the Russian religious Renaissance, which was a group of people who we'll explore tonight, who were heavily influenced by the westernizing traditions of the Enlightenment and Enlightenment thinkers, but equally as influenced by the Slavophiles. And that's really how we ended at the end of last week, looking at the extraordinary character of Vladimir Soloviev, the notions of all unity, and the notion of Sophia. So this evening, I want to look at three characters from that Russian religious Renaissance in a bit more depth. And hearing what people said last week, I want to look a little bit at their biographies, because their biographies tell us why they think as they think, and then touch on some of the elements of their thoughts. There's not enough time this evening to go into great depth, but I want to concentrate on a couple of things for each that show how that influence manifested and why I still think they're important to contemporary theology and indeed contemporary life culture. Because in a way, these three, and I've characterized them as a martyr, a priest, and a prophet. And they're not in the order, I'm afraid, in the pictures, but if you look at the pictures in that slide, on the bottom, you have the martyr, who is the one dressed in a priestly robe, who is Pavel Florensky. And on the right of him is Sergei Bulgakov. And then above him, as a relatively young man, is Nicolas Berdyaev. These three are the ones I'm going to talk about tonight. In many ways, they are the sort of zenith, the end of the intellectual tradition that flowered in the 19th century and 20th century before the Russian Revolution came. And in a sense, that revolution stunted to a degree the way that Orthodox or split the way that Orthodox theology developed from that moment in time. But all three of the folk about whom I shall speak tonight, Florensky, Bulgakov, and Berdyaev, are extraordinary in their own right. They are fertile minds, and all three have an extraordinary breadth of intellectual background and an originality of thought that makes them worthy of dipping into tonight. So the first of our protagonists, the one in the picture wearing the white robe of a priest and the hat of a priest and the staff of a priest, is Paul Florensky. And you'll see on the screen now a map marking where Pavel Florensky was born, and a rather wonderful and slightly naff photograph of where that is now in Azerbaijan. We find ourselves meeting this man in the southern Caucasus, far west of what is now Azerbaijan, in a town called Yevlakh. In the late 19th century, this was part of what was called the viceroyalty of the Caucasus, and in particular the governorate of Elizavetpol. It was a new city, established quite literally as a new city in 1880 with the birth of the railways. One of the engineers on that railway line welcomed his first son 2 years later in 1882. Pavel Florensky was born, the eldest of 6 children. And it's not unimportant to note that his father was a railway engineer, because Pavel had a close relationship with his father throughout his life. And indeed, his father's profession as an engineer was perhaps the source of his lifelong love of science and engineering. His father came from a strongly Russian Orthodox lineage, what they would call a Levitical family in the Orthodox tradition. His mother, Olga Saparova, was an Armenian of noble descent. She was an educated and intelligent woman. And so it's perhaps no surprise that with the engineer father and an intellectual mother, he would turn himself into a considerable intellect. Neither, though, of his parents were religious. And that's important to note. And here we'll begin to see some similarities already in terms of personality with Vladimir Soloviev, because Florensky was a thoughtful and complex child. He enjoyed study and reading, but he was equally at home outdoors. He loved to go out into the natural order, to observe nature, to take bits of nature home with him. He was something of a Gerald Durrell, collecting little bits and pieces and hoarding them in his house. When it came to studying, Florensky was sent to school in Tbilisi, what is now modern-day Georgia, in what was called the Second Classical Gymnasium, the equivalent really of a grammar school. He was gifted, but he was also sensitive. He didn't massively enjoy school, and in 1899, so he wasn't very old at this point, he was 17, he had the first of what would be 3 breakdowns. At this stage, he was not a believer. He was absolutely wedded to his study of physics, and he was deeply troubled by his inability to understand physics in its fullness, to, as it were, fully comprehend what physics was about. And one night he had a dream. Dreams, to know, are going to become important. In this dream, he was led into a deep and terrifying darkness. Through that terrifying darkness, there was one ray of light piercing. The ray of light bore the name of God. And the reports of this dream, and it's often the tradition when those sort of dream things are recounted in this period of time, he woke up and immediately said the words, "It is impossible to live without God." The vision would eventually lead to his conversion to Russian Orthodoxy, which would be a lifelong devotion and call. What is all the more extraordinary is that his parents were both lay and secular, despite the Orthodox heritage, and they really struggled to grasp his conversion. And his conversion did not stop his obsession, his fascination with phenomena and science. And so he enrolled at the University of Moscow to study mathematics, where he was under the tutelage of a man called Nicolas Berdyaev. That name is important because Berdyaev's son was a poet, a man called Andrei Bely, who would become one of the leading exponents in the Russian symbolist movement. Bely and Florensky were to become very close friends. That symbolist movement was part of a growing new religious consciousness that was emerging at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. It was slightly strange. It was influenced by a mixture of westernized philosophy, some slight strange sense of mystical practice, some of the teachings of Vladimir Soloviev, and it was led by a couple, Dmitry Merezhkovsky and his wife Zinaida Gippius. As Nicolas Berdyaev described them, they sprung from Nietzschean roots, but they had Dionysian elements as well as Christianity. And they were the ones that began to explore the concept of sophiology, which we'll come on to a bit later, that we initially saw in Soloviev, in those visions that he had of the eternal feminine, those three meetings, as he called it. This group were, as it were, concentrating on it. They talked about it, they practiced it, but they clearly lived also a fairly rich and liberated life. They were a convened group of free thinkers with a mystical bent. And their approach, perhaps not their practices, influenced the thoughts and writings of Florovsky. That's on to my next slide, which is the Moscow Spiritual Academy. It took me a while to work out where the Moscow Spiritual Academy was, because obviously these things changed over time. And it was originally called the Greek Latin Academy, I think. But it's actually in the complex, which is the Church of Trinity St. Sergius Lavra in Moscow, which is, as you can see from that picture, absolutely vast. And that's where he went following his studying at Moscow University. He could easily have had a career as an academic at Moscow University, but instead, as we heard, to the bafflement of his dear secular parents, he pursued ordination. But while he was studying at the Moscow Spiritual Academy here at St. Sergius Lavra from 1904, he is ordained, he's also teaching. He's teaching philosophy. And it's only in 1911 that he is ordained as a priest. In 1914, he supplicates for a master's degree with a work that is entitled The Pillar and the Ground of Truth. This would, in a later ituration, become one of his most profound works. And one of the things that I think is interesting to note for us is that a master's degree at this time had a sort of great cachet, and you could just publish it. And quite a few of these people, like Soloviev, like Florovsky, could publish their masters. And he does so as The Pillar and the Ground of Truth. From 1912 to 1921, he served as one of the parish priests at the parish of St. Mary Magdalene, and he also worked at St. Sergiev Posad, working alongside the nurses of the Red Cross there. So he's working as a priest as well as a scholar. It's quite clear that his priesthood is the primary vocation. And he's often pictured, as we'll see in a minute, always wearing that cassock. So that picture that we saw at the beginning, which if I can go back to, I will, of him dressed like that, he's almost always pictured after his very early years wearing his cassock. His academic studies in science continue, as does his service to the poor and his priesthood. But he practiced this in a climate of growing revolution. And in the 1920s, he continues to practice his science. We move on to the next slide. There's a picture of him again, quite a handsome, dashing young man. He continues to study science, but is arrested a number of times, actually. But eventually, he is arrested and he is imprisoned by the new communist regime. He was in a climate of totalitarianism that was just not willing to put up with him as a priest. He didn't really do anything particularly wrong. They had a number of charges against him. He was initially exiled to a place called Nizhny or Nizhny Novgorod in 1928. And then he was again imprisoned later on. And this time he was sent to imprisonment in what was called Solovki camp. Now, if you look at the slide there, hopefully you will be able to see my little arrow and a large red letters saying Solovki. Solovki camp was on the Solovetsky Islands. And that building, which is the Solovetsky monastery, and it is now still the monastery, under communism was repurposed as a camp. And rather grimly, the Russian name for that camp, the initials spell S-L-O-N, Slon, which is also a sort of joke because it was known as the elephant camp because it was so huge. and it was particularly given for artists, for those who were guilty of sedition. He had been accused of working with the Nazis against the Russian state to overthrow the Russian state. And although the charges were utterly trumped up, he eventually agreed to admit them in order that others could be released who denied them. So in a way, he was already at that stage showing some signs of martyrdom. That camp, by the way, was known as the Mother of Gulags by Solzhenitsyn, and eventually it changed its name. And this is quite important because around 1936, what was known as the Great Purge or the Great Terror by Stalin was begun. It was essentially a way of Stalin, who was utterly paranoid, reinforcing his own power and his own control over people. And as part of that Great Purge, this camp changed its name. So it was no longer, the initials no longer spelt Sloan or elephant, but instead spelt stone, which meant groan. And it was then that it basically turned into a camp for exterminating people. And it was in 1937 that Pavel Florovsky was then sentenced to death. And as part of this Great Purge, and I was reading the other day that scholars now suggest that as part of that purge, up to 700,000 people were murdered in order to reinforce Stalin's rule. And as far as I could tell in my reading, the whole of that camp by 1937 had been, of the inmates that were there when Florovsky was there, had been murdered in that purge. So he dies. He had been offered exile, but he had refused exile. Instead, he wanted to remain in that camp as a priest, as a pastor to other people. He was clearly an extraordinary man. He was great friends with the person we'll come on to speak about shortly, Sergei Bulgakov. And Sergei Bulgakov wrote this: "For me, Father Pavel was not only a phenomenon of genius, but also a work of art. So harmonious and beautiful was his image. We would need the words or brush or chisel of a great master to tell the world about him." So let's learn a little bit more about him. It's quite clear that he was a polymath. His writings are extraordinarily broad, from mathematics to physics to art to iconography to mystical works and to general and sort of free-thinking philosophical pondering. So I want to draw out a couple of threads. First, I want to look at the way he approached faith and reason and its impact on science and religion. Secondly, I want to look at his approach to icons and to iconography. I want to go back and leave that picture up while we talk about the first, because I've entitled that picture "The Cassock and the Crucible," because he did always maintain his priesthood alongside his science. His grasp of reason was absolutely rooted in his study of Kant and the idealist philosophers. And yet at the heart, Florovsky was always, as we've heard, a priest and eventually, arguably, a martyr. The very fact that he wore his cassock and his crucifix was probably one of the reasons why he eventually ends up dead, purely because of his witness to his priesthood. He didn't say that much. He was not guilty of publishing stuff that was particularly anti-regime. It was what he represented. He was vastly well-read, and in many ways he encapsulates the fusion of Westernization and Slavophilism. The Westernizers seeking to modernize Russia, to drag it through the intellectual progress of the West in a matter of decades that had taken centuries in the West, and yet also the Slavophiles, meanwhile, seeking to intellectually root the cultural future and progress in the mystical essence of Holy Rus. Let's turn to his work, his master's thesis, The Pillar and the Ground of Truth, as it later became published as. It, in many ways, is a groundwork, and it really does set about the way in which he understands reason and studies it. It's unusually written. Essentially, it's a form of lectures, but rather than being a form of lectures, it is written in the form of letters to an anonymous friend. Andrew Lau suggests that this is a little bit like the classical tradition in Plato, or the conversations that you have within the classical tradition. And we mustn't separate, he says, form from function. He says, to quote, "The intellectual argument is always an argument between two people, not between two positions." And that seems quite central to understanding Florovsky. He's not a disembodied philosopher or theologian. It's absolutely rooted in human relationship. In many ways, the pillar is a sort of dogmatic theology of sorts, an attempt to explain the faith as inherited within the Russian Orthodox tradition, but also in the light of the disciplines of poetry, arts, philosophy, and reason, mediated often through Western and Slavophile lenses together. And as a dogmatic theology, it's decidedly undogmatic. It can be quite hard to read. But Lau suggests that in the pillar, Florovsky is putting together an alternative to Kant. So rather than dropping that rather bomb-like in, let me just explain how that might be. In the pillar, Florovsky talks about antinomies, which is essentially the posh way of describing contradictions. For Kant, they are things that we try and fail to reconcile and discern through reason alone. For him, there are four distinct antinomies, contradictions, two mathematical and two that are dynamic. In his critique of pure reason, this is one of the things that he wants to show, the attempt to use reason to point to the limits of reason, to point to the way in which contradictions cannot be resolved using reason. Florovsky was very well read and versed in Kant, as he was equally within the Russian tradition, and he takes an entirely different approach. Like Kant, he is keen to juxtapose modern attempts to comprehend reason with faith. But he doesn't, though, try and suggest that either can be fully comprehended by the other, and he accepts that Christian faith and reason, as understood in the Enlightenment, will lead to these antinomies, these contradictions, these oppositions that cannot be reconciled. Florovsky writes this: "For rationality, in Russian razvudok, truth is contradiction, and this contradiction becomes explicit as soon as truth acquires a verbal formulation. The thesis and the antithesis together form the expression of truth. In other words, truth is an antinomy, and it cannot fail to be such." But rather than showing the paucity of reason, Florovsky suggests such contradictions, far from being a problem, a concern, or a worry, are in fact actually a delight. Louth writes, quote, "He does more than just delight in them in a rhetorical way. He sees this contradiction as having a crucial role for theology, for they point to something fundamental about the nature of reason." End quote. Florovsky rejects Kant's theory of antinomy, suggesting that it is not a problem of reason, but a problem with a lack of understanding of the place of God. Instead of being indicative of what we cannot know or understand, these antinomies simply make a better argument for God. In many ways, this is a sort of rationalized reading of Kant that goes quite deep into the early church fathers and the ideas of that have then come to explain apophatic theology, the idea that actually it's what we cannot say about God that says what God is, where words finish, and that often, as it's construed in Western Catholic theology, negative theology comes about. So what we cannot say about God, rather than trying to over-explain God. So in these contradictions, Florovsky actually finds, in many ways, a proof of God. The very act of seeing the contradiction is, in many ways, a liberation. He writes, "The act of self-renunciation of rationality is an expression of antinomy. Only dogma, being antinomic, does not constrain our freedom and allows voluntary belief or wicked unbelief." Both Kant and Florovsky agree that antinomies exist, that there are contradictions, that there are deficiencies in reason. For Kant, this leads to the exclusion of things that reason cannot explore, or a willingness to say no further. For Florovsky, they are in fact a route to freedom. They are a route to God. Another route to God for Florovsky was art and iconography. And so I've now put up, you should be on your screen now, the Rublev icon. In the first talk, I mentioned that one of the early marks of Russia in the medieval period as an increasingly independent part of Christendom flourishing in its own right was the burgeoning of its own art and culture in the 13th century. This was seen in the flowering of newly built churches and cathedrals, but also in the growing trend of iconography, which is best and most clearly represented by Andrei Rublev's Trinity, written in the 14th century. As Russia flexed and grew, as it looked westwards, as it began to embrace reforms that Peter the Great enforced or encouraged, depending on your viewpoint, it's fair to say that Russia's distinct tradition of iconography begins to wane. Western styles of painting begin to dominate. Florovsky, however, was at the forefront of rediscovering Russian iconography, and in some ways, rediscovering iconography in our culture entirely. He was let me get the dates for that. He was from 1912 onwards, he was on the Committee for Art and Antiquities in the Church of St. Sergei Trinity Lavra, that vast and imposing church seminary complex. And of course, housed within those walls was, in fact, that very same Rublev icon. Florovsky wrote extensively about art and icons, but it was always informed by his scientific and theological hinterland. Once again, he goes back to criticize Kantian understandings of reason and reality, and he writes an essay which is called Reverse Perspective. And this is fascinating, and he uses geometry, returning to his first love, to mathematics, to say that essentially westernized art, what we might call linear art, or he calls linear art, is simplistic and naive. Now, you might suddenly recoil back and say, actually, surely, in fact, far from being naive, Western art is more complex than icons, but he would disagree. He does so by pointing out the novelty and simplistic ways in which linear art uses perspective, hence the linear perspective. And Lauth gives a really good description in his book on modern Orthodox thinkers, which talks about the way in which linear art or modern art pushes you to a particular point. And he uses as an image a camera. When you use a camera, be it on a phone or on your own camera, it focuses on a particular point and everything drags you in to that particular point. And so with modern perspective in post-Renaissance art, you are forced towards a point or you are forced along certain lines. Florovsky argues that this is a Euclidean worldview using Euclidean geometry. It is, he argues, egocentric, humanocentric, and to a degree, unreal and confected, because it's forcing you to one particular place and it's forcing you, as it were, to be the center, you and your eyes being focused. So in a way, it closes down your vision to one particular place. It focuses you tunnel-like into the middle. Florovsky argues that such art affects us as we view it. But more than that, he says art affects the way we live in the world. And that sort of linear art, he argues, leaves us passive and, quote, doomed to every kind of passivity. It makes you, quote, an observer who brings nothing of his own into the world, who cannot even synthesize his own fragmentary impressions. He does not enter into a living interaction with the world and does not live within. Now, I said earlier that dreams would be fascinating here, and they are, because what Florovsky does is compare an icon to a dream. He describes dreams as the thinnest membrane of materiality, almost a phenomenon of another world. And he writes, from a heavenly point of view, a dream symbolizes earth. From the earthly perspective, a dream symbolizes heaven. And he says icons are similar. And the image that comes to me when he talks like this is the idea of almost like Narnia's wardrobe, where you go through the doors and there is an entirely new world that is framed within the back of the wardrobe space. So an icon, or as he describes it in another essay, the iconostasis, the big wall of icons in front of the sanctuary, that is a window. But more than that, it is a portal to another world. And he points out when he's talking about icons, that you can see them the same way from any perspective. There is no perspective on them. From wherever you look at them, you are looking at the same thing. It is a portal into heaven, as opposed to simply something that we look at that focuses us in, that is about us. It is about heaven. Sadly, he was not to be able to write anything after 1922. All of his works were taken from him. He was not even given access to pen and paper, although he continued to try and do experiments. He never wavered from his convictions. He never left science or scientific research. And I would argue he is a martyr. Although the Russian Orthodox Church made a whole new army of martyrs in 2000, and he was excluded from it. And that's probably because his writings bear some of the marks of the concept of Sophia, which we'll talk about more later, or holy wisdom, which he had got from Soloviev. It was a term we'll find in a minute much more beloved by Sergei Bulgakov, who was Florensky's great friend. It's to him that we now shall turn. Now, Florensky was a priest, but as I said, perhaps best characterized as a martyr, refusing to be exiled, remaining in Russia, remaining loyal to his faith and to his intellectual pursuits, and dying as a result. But of the three I'm speaking about tonight, I think it's arguable that you could define Sergei Bulgakov first and foremost as a priest. Let me move the slide forward. There is Sergei Bulgakov. He couldn't argue he's not a priest there. He's extraordinary. He's often actually pictured as an example of an Orthodox priest. And there's a quotation from Bulgakov, which I'll come into in a minute. Bulgakov was born in Livny, which I should now be able to come on to, in the Oryol Oblast, which you can see on the map there, which is south of Moscow. And it's a very small city, not much bigger than Litchfield, where I live, but it has been an extraordinarily important one strategically. It's on the Livenka River, and it probably grew up as a defense to Moscow against Mongol invasion from Crimea, and it remained a strategically important city, and I imagine it remains now a strategically important city. And even in World War II, it was fought over and eventually occupied by the Nazis. Bulgakov was born in 1871, the sixth generation of clergy in his family, another Levitical Orthodox family. His name, interesting, his surname, Bulgak, comes from the Tartars, and it would have originated from a Tartar family. His father worked as a cemetery priest, and Sergei was sent to a seminary at an early age. He was not happy, and it would lead to him losing his faith. I don't know if you've noticed, but in Florensky, there is the crisis of faith from an atheist perspective. In Soloviev, there is a crisis of faith, and again in Bulgakov, there is a crisis of faith, probably because of these turbulent circumstances which they're living intellectually as well as culturally. So he lost his faith and became a devout Marxist, and he enrolled at Moscow University to study political economy and law, full of political idealism, determined to contribute to the political economy in a Marxist way. In the first decade of the 1900s in Russia, he becomes interested in German idealism, and that would make an impact because it offered another political angle to thinkers and philosophers like Bulgakov. It was profoundly attractive to Bulgakov, in fact. He and his friend Nicolas Berdyaev, who we'll come on to later, were both influenced by Soloviev and Dostoyevsky, but at this stage, they were just beginning to learn of the idealists. In the 1890s, having received a fellowship from the University of Moscow, though, he was able to tour around Europe. And this, studying the agrarian economies, together with the idealism that was beginning to affect him, meant that he had become growing in his disillusionment with Marxism. Valier wrote this: Bulgakov appeared to be on a normal career path for a budding Marxist academic. There was only just one problem. By 1900, Bulgakov had concluded that Marx's critique of capitalism was utterly flawed. Despite this, during his time, he continued to write about Marxist idealism, whilst also experiencing a recovery of his Christian faith. More and more, he began to see that the progress hailed by Marxism could only make sense within a paradigm of faith. So he was shifting from Marxism to idealism and more towards the Christian faith. And like the others we've spoken about tonight, Bulgakov's return to faith occurs through a series of visions. Is it surprising or unsurprising that there are 3 visions, which reminds us a little bit of the 3 meetings of Vladimir Soloviev? But in the late 1890s, we see the first one coming to Bulgakov when he was still a Marxist. But he was walking through the Caucasus Mountains, the borders of Georgia and Russia, which you can see in the right-hand side of the slide. And suddenly it dawned on him that the Marxist materialism that he had dedicated so much of his study and life to, and his commitment to in political terms, left him feeling dismal, left him with no hope at all. A second vision comes to him when he visits the gallery of Swinger in Dresden. There he sees the picture of the Sistine Madonna. And remember, he would have read Solovyov, so he'd have read about the eternal feminine. He'd have read about Solovyov's own 3 meetings. He also encounters Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia would make a tremendous impact upon him. And there he begins to formulate and take on the idea of Sophia that we learn about first of all in Solovyov. Before that, though, comes his final conversion in a hermitage in the middle of the forest. And that begins his journey back to the Holy Church. It was not until 1918, Pentecost, that he would be ordained. He was ordained in the Danilov monastery, and here he began to involve himself in the church, taking part in the Reform Synod of 1917 and 18. That was one of the reasons he agreed to be ordained, because he thought that change would come. Remember that he had these westernized roots, this Marxist and idealist education. He could see the faults of an old-fashioned, utterly Slavic view of the church, as well as the church's absolute devotion to the Tsar and to the imperial world. It was the synod and its independence that convinced him to become a priest. Oops, sorry, go back. Let's move on to some of his thought. Caught up in a world that was rapidly changing and secularizing, Bulgakov was surrounded by that group of other intellectuals. And I want to return to his experience of Hagia Sophia. It was relatively early on, so after his first conversion, that he goes en route to Prague, and then he visits Hagia Sophia. By this stage, it's a mosque, but he looks up at the dome, and the dome convinces him of the beauty of creation being conveyed to him in somehow a mystical sense, in the same way that it was conveyed to him in the Caucasus Mountains, in the same way that it came to him in the beauty of the hermitage in the forest, in the same way that it came to him through the Sistine Madonna in Swinger. Eventually, he is forced to leave in 1922. I spoke about it last week on the Philosopher's Ships. He was exiled to Paris, to the considerable Russian community there. He continues to work as a confessor and a theologian. He is, though, eventually rejected by his own church. If you remember last week, there were 3 churches by this stage. There was the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia. There was the Russian Orthodox Church in exile. And then there was what's called the Exarchate, which was Russians who were under Constantinople, so under the Greek Orthodox authority, but still Russian. The first 2, the Russians abroad, and the Russian Orthodox at home rejected Bulgakov. And they rejected him because of what we would call sophiology, Sophia. So let's start with Sophia, because it's an interesting idea. It's not an easy or a simple idea, and it comes from this idea of zjedinstvo, or all unity, that we saw in Soloviev. It has been extraordinarily controversial from the moment of Soloviev right through Florovsky and through Bulgakov. And the best way of understanding it, really, is to see it both in terms of a liturgical and mystical understanding of how God is understood by humans. So Bulgakov's work is all about divine humanity, the idea that God becomes human in Christ, and therefore we become divine through that act of grace. That, of course, also comes from Soloviev's concept of God-manhood or divine humanity. The divine humanity for Bulgakov is conceived and understood through this gift of Sophia, holy wisdom, which draws a little bit on the wisdom tradition of the Old Testament. If you read the wisdom tradition, those proverbs telling us that wisdom appears in all things, wisdom mediates understanding, wisdom is something in and of itself. The best way I've found of understanding Sophia is to see it almost as the mortar that holds together the Trinity, and the mortar that holds together our relationship with the Trinity, almost like an energy of sorts. Now, you might well say to yourself, why do we need Sophia? You might well say to yourself, is it a fourth person of the Holy Trinity? That is precisely what a lot of the Russian Orthodox have said. Why do you need this extra idea of the eternal feminine? Why do we need to, from the visions of Soloviev and from the visions of Bulgakov, come up with this new concept or energy that helps us to relate to the natural order? Because it's almost a sense of beauty in and of itself. It's almost the energy of creation that is the way in which we are able to relate to God or understand God. When we talk about natural theology and seeing God in the world, the way in which we can communicate that that is God as opposed to simple beauty or simple materialism is through the gift of Sophia. Sadly, he was condemned by the Orthodox within Russia and still remains condemned. It's one of the reasons, because he also dabbled in it, that Florovsky was not made a martyr, as I've said. And Russian Orthodox Church still regards sophiology as a heresy. Fascinatingly, in the West, it's had much more interest. And you may or you may not have come across movements such as radical orthodoxy, which were quite popular in the early 20th century in Cambridge, in this country. And some of my friends definitely within that tradition, they're very keen on Sophia. But it's fascinating that in the West it's popular, whereas in Russia and in Greek Orthodoxy it's still regarded with a degree of suspicion. It's rather tragic that this priest, who dedicated his life to reforming the church and establishing this as central to his theology, died in 1944, condemned by many of his friends and by many of those scholars who had studied so much with him. Worth noting, though, that the Exarchate, those Russians who were under the jurisdiction of Constantinople, did not reject his thought, and he remains one of the thinkers that they approve of. And I'll come on to why I think it's important that he is regarded in the West and not in Russia at the end. Let me come on to our final, I've gone backwards there. The final person. This is the person I did my my doctorate on, Nicolas Berdyaev, and I want to call him the forgotten prophet. So we've had a martyr, we've had a priest, now we have a prophet. Nicolas Berdyaev was born in 1874. To give you some context, in this country, that was the year that Winston Churchill was born. Berdyaev was born in Kiev. His father was an officer in the Imperial Guards, so he was posh. His mother was a Russian princess. So he lived an aristocratic life. His mother would have spoken French at home. His father was a great fan of Voltaire and therefore not much of a fan of religion. His mother would practice religion in the Latin Rite or Roman Catholic Rite, although the suggestion in Berdyaev's own words were that was mainly because it was a sort of classy thing to do, and it put her into a certain bracket. Berdyaev was one of the most famous thinkers in the mid-20th century, although you would not know it now. If you own a copy of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, you'll find that the preface at the beginning of that is by Berdyaev. He was one of those people that was an intellectual hero, a sort of public intellectual of his day. On the left of your screen, you'll see the sort of place in which he grew up. He would have had a smaller version of that as his entire house. You'll see him in the middle there as a young man. But he writes, as you can see there, that from the beginning, he felt that he had fallen into an alien realm. He was sent to school at the Guards' School, so to become a young officer, which he hated, and he felt extremely lonely. Physically, he wasn't very good, and he had what was called a tic douloureux. He had a really distinct tic that made him a laughingstock and deeply unpopular, and I think he was badly bullied. So he then, like Bulgakov, like so many born at the time he was born, goes back to study, begins to resit his exams, passes his exams, and goes to university to study natural sciences. I think I said last week, science was the thing to do, as the fashionable thing. And so he begins life as what you can only really describe as a posh communist or a posh Marxist at that stage. So he's really enthralled by the political issues of the day. And he gets involved with movements at university in Kiev, with particularly the Social Democratic Party. And he gets involved in distributing leaflets for them. One day, somebody discovers one of those leaflets. It has his name on it, and he is arrested. He is sent and exiled to a place called Vologda, which you'll see there on your map. Gives you an idea of where it is. Quite a long way from Kiev. But his exile wasn't indescribable, in that he lived in this hotel, which is still there, called the Golden Anchor, and he had a suite of rooms, and he was allowed, extraordinarily, bearing in mind how he was arrested, to offer lectures. He had, we learn, a butler, so that when you came to see him, you had to talk to the butler before you get an audience. It was not a tough life to be exiled in 1898 to Vologda, to the Golden Anchor. He returns in 1901, and he marries a woman called Lydia Trudasheva. She was, in her own way, quite a mystical woman. So he marries her in 1904, and he's beginning at this stage to really explore idealism. So having been a wedded Marxist, he then goes on tour, and he goes over to Germany, and he goes to Heidelberg, and he encounters some Kantians there, a man called Wilhelm Windelband, and he's absolutely enchanted by Wilhelm Windelband and by idealism. But he comes home, and a little bit like Bulgakov, dissatisfied with idealism, and he gets mixed up with that group of symbolists, Zinaida Gippius and Merezhkovsky, and that group of poets, André Belly, and he becomes influenced by the mystical elements too. And then he encounters Dostoyevsky, and that is a moment of conversion for him to Christianity. This is what's extraordinary about Berdyaev. He is not a priest. He has no ordination at any point. He is never really a Christian of great commitment to church-going. But gradually over that 10 years, from 1904 to about 1914, he becomes increasingly convinced that he is a Christian. Many of the Orthodox around him would not be convinced that he is a Christian because he was quite interesting in his thought. He was what you would call a free thinker. He, in 1914, objects to the nationalist attitudes of the church. He is, I spoke about this last week, condemned by the court, and he is looking like he's going to be executed for standing against the Russian Orthodox Church. It is a very bittersweet piece of luck that the Russian Revolution comes. And because the Russian Revolution has come, he is not able to be tried, and he is eventually exiled because the entire regime changes. And like Bulgakov, he is sent abroad on one of the philosopher's ships, whereas Bulgakov goes through Prague to Paris. Berdyaev, first of all, goes to the Weimar, and then eventually ends up in Paris with the huge emigre population. In terms of thought, what is interesting about Berdyaev is he is rooted in both Solovyov, but also a man called Jakob Böhme, who we talked a bit about last week, a 16th century Teutonic mystic. This Teutonic mystic talks about something called the Ungrund, sometimes spelled the Urgrund, which is the unnothing, the nothingness that precedes creation. But Böhme talks about this nothingness as if it's a something. So as if something preceded creation, as if something preceded God, which of course is a heresy. But Berdyaev doesn't see it as a heresy, he sees it as a mystical concept. And he instead believes that this Ungrund, this nothingness, is freedom. As he becomes a Christian, Berdyaev begins to see that this idea of freedom as a sort of profound, utter void is given meaning through Jesus Christ and God manhood, this idea that through the power and energy of God, we are absorbed into God, which is utter freedom. But all the way through his thought, you have this almost contradiction between the utter freedom that Berdyaev wants to seek and the idea that this freedom could be found in the God-man. Is he wedded to freedom as a philosophical concept, or is he wedded to the idea of Jesus Christ and God-manhood? Is God-manhood freedom, or is it a much more conventional understanding of the Christian tradition? One of the things that's wonderful about Berdyaev, and you can read him in translation, he wrote in French, I think he wrote in Russian, and it was translated into French, and the English translations are from the French. He writes beautifully. I once had the privilege of meeting Rowan Williams when I was a curate. My vicar introduced me to him, and I said, I was doing my doctorate in Berdyaev, and Rowan Williams said, oh yes, he sounds absolutely wonderful, but what is he really saying? Not very much at all, which I think is a little unfair. But he is chaotic, he is aphoristic, he is a free thinker. He is a mystic, I would argue, in the way that he writes. Whereas Bulgakov and Florovsky have more structure and dogma in the way they write, Berdyaev has absolutely none, partly because he believes in this all-embracing idea of freedom as a mystical concept. He's known as the philosopher of freedom par excellence. Freedom was his great thing. And in a way, he was a prophet because he was not part of the church except as a critical friend. He was always criticizing the institutional church. He was always criticizing any institution. And in many ways, he was a prophet because if you think about the way in which our society now lives, it is in the pursuit of a certain sort of freedom, not the sort of freedom I think that Berdyaev would want, but it is a freedom that is free from institutionalization. It is a freedom that exalts the power not only of humanity, but of the human will. And Berdyaev was influenced by Nietzsche in terms of the idea that the human will is extraordinarily powerful. And when he talked about the God-man and the idea that freedom comes through the God-man, there was often more influence, more emphasis on the man than there was on the God. And that is another criticism of Berdyaev. But there is no doubt that he prophesies a world in which we live now, which is where freedom is regarded as perhaps the most important thing, perhaps at the expense of God, almost certainly, and that freedom is without any institutional boundary. What is unfair to say about Berdyaev, though, is that he was not a Christian. For when he died in 1948, he was found slumped at his desk by his sister-in-law. Next to him, lying open on his desk, were the order for evening prayer for the day, for he prayed every morning and every evening. So although he wasn't accepted much by the church authorities, and he was, like Bulgakov, utterly rejected by Russian Orthodoxy, he remains, in my mind, a Christian philosopher of freedom, a prophet that might make us uncomfortable, and a philosopher definitely worth reading simply for his own merits alone. I want to end there, but I want to end by saying something which I think is important. And I said it last week and I repeat it again this week. These were people who were brought up as either atheists or became atheists and then returned to faith through their reading of the idealist philosophers and their reading of the Slavophile traditions. That's the first point. The second point is that extraordinarily, and this came from thinking about what David asked last week, they are not popular in Russia or with Russian Orthodoxy. In many ways, Russian Orthodoxy, and I'll talk about this in the last talk I do, has returned to the Slavophile view of the world, the imperial and right-wing Slavophile view of the world, where the entire future of Russia and Orthodoxy is to be found in Slavic traditions that are almost pre-modern. Whereas these three were absolutely modernist at the same time as being rooted in the Slavophile tradition. Thank you. Just one more picture. This is the, I love this picture. This is just for interest. In the middle, you have a picture of Bulgakov as an older man in Paris. On the right, because this was a sort of real group of thinkers, you'll see Berdyaev in conversation with a philosopher in the middle called Paul Desjardins, a French philosopher. And then on the left of Paul Desjardins is the controversial French novelist André Gide. On the far left of the picture, you'll see Berdyaev, extraordinary man who's very, very tall. And on the right of him, the woman in the middle there, is Mother Maria Skobotska, who was a woman who, again, died in a concentration camp, having saved many Jewish lives. And she was part of that movement in Paris. In fact, she was arrested in Paris, and it was in Paris where she was doing that great work. She's worthy of studying in her own right, too. Thank you. I'm going to just take the presentation down. Any questions?
I think my feeling is that I need to listen to it again because it's a lot of very new ideas and ways of looking at things. And yeah, I think I'm going to have to listen to it again before I can really ask even an intelligent question. I'm sorry.
I did try to make it. I mean, they are a bit bonkers, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
And they think about things completely differently, as does the Orthodox quite often, from Western ways. And in many ways that's deliberate. But I try to minimize, because some of the stuff is so abstract. And it is, in a way, it is mystical. So in a sense, to try and understand it in a kind of lecture-y way, it's always going to be hard.
So, I mean, picking up that comment about mysticism, I mean, to what extent do you think they were looking for an experience of God rather than an intellectual understanding? Because they all sound as if they were thinkers as well. You know,
yeah, they were thinkers, but they sort of, I mean, when I said about Berdyaev, it's absolutely true. To a degree, it's true of all of them, but they don't write. You know, if you read Karl Barth or something like that, it's you know where you're going. If you read Thomas Aquinas, you know where you're going. When you read Solovyov, you will get brain ache, and it really is. It's just very different, and I think it is the Eastern tradition, because everything in that Orthodox tradition is rooted in the liturgy. So really, if you want to understand, I mean, it's one of the things that Lao says. If you want to understand Sophia, then really you need to worship. That worshipping is a way of understanding Sophia, which in a sense is a cop-out, and in a sense is me sort of saying, what's the point of having a lecture about it? But I think that is true, that Sophia, it's a mystical concept. And again, I think my redemption of Berdyaev is to say, when he's talking about freedom, he's understanding it mystically. He's not trying to, he's never going to be able to put it fully into words. In the same way that Florovsky says, actually, contradictions make sense of God because they don't make sense, and you can't make sense of God. Does that make it? Does that?
Yeah.
So a lot of this is actually saying you're not going to make sense of it because it's experience.
in a sense, there is always things about God that you're never going to know or understand.
Yeah, or that you're never going to understand in the way we're talking tonight.
Yeah.
So, you know, great argument for not doing lectures on Russian mystics, but in a sense is that there is a sense of saying, actually, I mean, I love it. I love this stuff because I think you understand God rationally in worship. I just don't think the way in which reason, as is understood so much by the West, is adequate, and I think that's the influence of these people.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's introduced an area which I was painfully ignorant of. So thank you very much.
It is really hard. I mean, it's not really hard. It's the best way I think of understanding any Russian Orthodoxy is to go to the Easter Vigil in a Russian Orthodox church, and it sort of all makes sense because you realize it is an absolutely absorbing. And you always make me think, David, in really helpful ways, because I wonder as well if part of what they do is they go through this, that they come across the novelty of idealism, and they love idealism. They love all these modern Western ideas. But then they return to what sort of internally made sense to them. Because they all do that. They all have a sort of crisis of faith. They all study idealism. They all come back.
Yeah.
But they have been Westernized, which is why they're not really accepted by the Russian Orthodox Church still.
So it is fair to say that there is this return to a search for an experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think they all found Marxism really. I think they probably found the passion around. So one of the things I knocked out the Berdyaev stuff was he goes to prison in 1890. Well, he gets exiled. No, sorry, he goes to prison just before he gets exiled for a short period of time, and he says it's wonderful. It's the best time of his life because it's the most community he's ever had, which is quite strange. But then I think all that passion around it begins to fade.
Yeah,
you know, a bit like Bulgakov walking through the Caucasus suddenly says, actually, there's no hope. It's just material.
Thank you.
No, thank you. And I would say to anyone, it really isn't about understanding. It's really about sort of having some connection with. There's a good book, which I've used a lot of in these, which is Modern Orthodox Thinkers by Andrew Louth. And it is relatively readable. The other one that is worth getting, and you'll get it secondhand on A Books. You might even get it new, actually. I bought it secondhand. Is Nicolas Zernov, which is called The Russian Religious Renaissance. And he writes beautifully, and he lived and died in Oxford. He moved over with the English diaspora and died. And I shared a doctor with him. My doctor when I was a college chaplain was his doctor. But yeah, and they really are worth digging into because it's just a very different, very Eastern.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, I'm hoping to do a final one, which will be much more accessible, and I'm going to do it on the essay that Vladimir Putin wrote, because that's a kind of summary of where they've got to in Holy Rus. And when I get a date from Dan for that, I'll let you know. And if you want to come to it, please do. Thank you for this is the first time I've ever, you'll be unsurprised to know, done a Zoom lecture. And it's a very, very strange experience, I have to say. And I've learned a lot in 3 weeks. So thank you very much for your forbearance.
Yes, thank you very much.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
Take care. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.